From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to see you, yes. My name is Martha Kennedy, for those of you who don't know, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to the 2016-2017 Swann Fellows Lecture today. This program is sponsored by the Swann Foundation for Caricature and Cartoon and the Prints and Photographs Division. The Swann Foundation is one of the few that provides support for scholarly graduate research in the field of caricature and cartoon, and it does this through annually awarded fellowships. Since 1977, the foundation has been an important part of the library's graphic arts program. The foundation underwrites a number of initiatives relating to these art forms here at the library, and they include preservation and processing of the library's comic art, development of these collections, related public presentations, and many exhibitions that are mounted in the Graphic Arts Gallery and other spaces in the library's Jefferson building. In fact, there are several up right now, and I encourage you to go and see them. I should say that this event is being filmed for future broadcast on the library's website and other media. We encourage you to ask questions and offer comments after the talk, but please realize that if you participate in the Q&A, you are consenting to the library possibly using your filmed image and remarks. Today's speaker, Elizabeth Nijdam, is a PhD candidate in the Department of Germanic Languages and Literatures at the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor. Her research focuses on German comics after 1989, and her dissertation traces East German artistic traditions into the post-unification comics of Anke Feuchtenberger and Henning Wackenrath. And these two artists are members of an oppositional artist group called PGH, Glühende Zukunft, which I believe is translated as Glowing Future, which I think is an interesting name. Elizabeth's research has been published in the International Journal of Comic Art and World Literature Today. She has worked extensively also on comics in the classroom, and in fact published a chapter on teaching German history with graphic novels in a book entitled Class, Please Open Your Comics. She currently serves as secretary for the Executive Committee of the International Comic Arts Forum, and she's a member at large on the executive board of the Comic Studies Society's Graduate Student Caucus. In October of this year, she will start work on her book project entitled Paneled Pasts, East German History and Memory in the German Graphic Novel. And she'll be doing this as a postdoctoral fellow in the Berlin Program for Advanced German and European Studies at the Freie Universität Berlin. It has been a pleasure for me to introduce Elizabeth to resources in P&P and some other divisions here in the library. Her lecture today is titled, It's Not Just Horror and Black, the Comics of Anke Feuchtenberger, and their many expressionisms. Please join me in welcoming Elizabeth. Thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I'd like to thank the Swann Foundation and the Prints and Photographs Division for inviting me here today. It's been a wonderful week up in the P&P reading room where I've taken many photographs of the first 8 issues of Raw. And you'll be able to see those photographs in my presentation today every time you see my thumb or my fingers. Those are photographs that I took here at the Library of Congress. So this chapter of my dissertation and this presentation and talk today wouldn't have been possible without this experience here. Okay. These panels are from the early sequential art of Anke Feuchtenberger, an East German graphic artist who was trained in the German Democratic Republic but began making comics in United Germany after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Beyond the very fact that she embraced the comics medium, which was an artistic form virtually non-existent for adult audiences in socialist East Germany, a striking feature of her work is its German expressionist visual rhetoric. Feuchtenberger's sequential art emulates the aesthetic of the woodcut print, the claustrophobic and angular space of German expressionist cinema, and the deformed bodies and elongated appendages of the work of German expressionist artists Otto Dix and George Grosz. Feuchtenberger's comics recall the aesthetics of the German modernism of the early 20th century, but interestingly, this is a visual language that predates her artistic production by more than 7 decades. Comments on the role and significance of Feuchtenberger's expressionist visual rhetoric are not unusual in the discourse surrounding German comics after 1989. In the exhibition catalog for the Goethe Institute's Comics, Manga, and Co., from 2010, for example, Andreas Plathaus attributes the, quote, return of German comics to the emergence of East German graphic artists in the scene, observing that Anke Feuchtenberger and other members of the graphic arts collective PGH Glühende Zukunft were not beholden to the economic demands of successful comics production due to their work as graphic artists, which granted them the space to experiment in the comics medium. He continues his assessment of their innovations by implicating their quote-unquote solid education in the East German graphic arts, which, he writes, instructed them in techniques such as hand presses, woodcut, and linocut printing, calligraphy, and book design, quote, that had long been abandoned by West German art colleges and other educational establishments, end quote. Plathaus thereby situates the technical and aesthetic innovations of Feuchtenberger and other East German artists working in the comics medium in their training in the GDR and the nation's artistic traditions. Plathaus's observation reflects the importance of Feuchtenberger and other East German artists in redefining German comics after 1989. However, it lacks nuance. So here is a list of 3 artist collectives that were founded in the 1990s, and next to the individuals' names where it says EG are those East Germans that participated in the forming of these collectives. While the techniques these artists mastered in the GDR informed some of her aesthetic experiments, Feuchtenberger's expressionist influences were not entirely born of her East German artistic training. In fact, the expressionist visual rhetoric of Feuchtenberger's poster art and graphic narration after 1989 looks nothing like the experiments in neo-expressionism that occurred in the last 2 decades of the GDR. So here on the bottom we have 2 examples of paintings that sort of mobilize the neo-expressionist aesthetic, and then we have 2 posters on the right-hand side. This presentation therefore complicates Plathaus's implication that German comics were reborn as a consequence of Feuchtenberger and other artists' training in the East German graphic arts, citing alternative comics and, specifically Art Spiegelman and Francois Moulet's Raw magazine, as an important but unacknowledged factor in the development of Feuchtenberger's expressionist aesthetics. Furthermore, I illustrate how Feuchtenberger's adoption and adaptation of an expressionist visual rhetoric connects a number of expressionist artistic styles, including early German expressionism, East German neo-expressionism, and the expressionist visual rhetoric of American alternative comics to simultaneously distance her post-1989 work from her East German training while also still incorporating elements of it. I examine how this engagement of multiple expressionisms complicates assertions of West German cultural hegemony after 1989. Aligning this project with scholarship of Paul Cook, my analysis of Feuchtenberger's graphic narration demonstrates the importance of East German artistic traditions and the agency of East German artists alongside international innovations in comics art in redefining spheres of, quote, Western artistic production after 1989. Borrowing terminology from cultural theorist Homi Bhabha, I argue that the sequential art of Feuchtenberger and other East German graphic artists thereby produced a hybrid space of cultural production where East German artistic practice was not subverted to Western artistic traditions, but operated in tandem with them. In representing East Germany since unification, Paul Cook engages post-colonial theory to understand the fate of East German culture in post-unification Germany. He posits that the process of German unification has been presented as a quasi-subjugation of East by the West. where West German culture has remained hegemonic and East German culture has been suppressed, ignored, and systematically erased. Most notably articulated in Wolfgang Dümke's and Fritz Willmar's co-edited volume Kolonisierung der DDR, which means colonization of the GDR, these authors describe post-unification circumstances of East German culture in conventionally colonialist terms, citing the dismantling of the East German economic system, the development of a new social hierarchy featuring imported leadership from the Federal Republic, and the systematic denigration of local practices, collective identity, and shared morals as evidence. Cook continues, however, to comment on how limiting this perception of unification may be, remarking that the relationship between East and West German regions is much more complex than post-colonial theory may suggest. Ultimately, he observes that the colonization of East Germany is more about the perception and representation of the East-West German relationship than the reality of the situation. However, this perception of colonized East Germany has important consequences on the way East and West Germans, quote, relate to the unified state and the legacy of the past, end quote. Co-opting Baba's term cultural hybridity allows me to examine the impact of East German artistic traditions on post-unification German comics, while also highlighting the importance of other expressionist traditions in the development of a hybrid form of post-unification cultural production. Feuchtenberger's series Bärmi and Klett is an excellent example of the emergence of an early German expressionist visual rhetoric in her work. The four narratives of Bärmi and Klett span her first four publications: Schräge Schwestern, a 1993 collection of comics from German-speaking female artists by Elefant and Fess, Herzhaft und Lebenslänglich, also published in 1993, part of the Crunch series edited by Attack's brother Martin Barber, Mutterkuchen, Feuchtenberger's first official publication by Joachim Enterprises in 1995, and Die kleine Dame, the artist's first collaboration with Kathrin de Vries, published in 1997. They feature surreal narratives of a mother and child as they traverse a frightening reality of strange nightmares and mysterious men in an alienating world. The narratives are highly imaginative and symbolic, offering allegorical interpretations of the relationship between mother and child and man and woman. Her aesthetic evolves over the half-decade of her production, but each graphic narrative maintains unequivocal links to German Expressionism. The bodies Feuchtenberger represents feature sharp angles and elongated appendages. The spaces in which the action unfolds are constricted and claustrophobic, and the perspective from which the images are drawn is angled sharply to the picture plane, changing dramatically between panels. German Expressionism, the leading style of German modernism, refers to a number of related movements that emerged before the First World War, but reached their peak during the 1920s. Defined by a visual rhetoric of sharp angles, deep shadows, and dramatic contrasts, surreal landscape, extensive symbolism, and emotive and often unrealistic representation, it emphasized personal expression over objective reality, characterized by simplified or distorted forms and exaggerated color. However, a defining characteristic that set Expressionism apart from other modernist movements, and indeed almost any other period of art history, was its dedication to printmaking and works on paper in general. The woodcut print was an invaluable tool of the movement, and as Expressionists encouraged essentially every painter of the period to turn to the graphic arts. With an emphasis on geometric forms accompanied by alternating patterns of solid color and carved pattern to produce texture, shading, and depth, the aesthetic of the woodcut print and its variants are immediately recognizable and associated with German Expressionism. In Feuchtenberger's 1993 Bärmi and Klett graphic narrative, featured in Herzhaft und Lebenslänglich, Der Schatz, the protagonist's emaciated body is represented topless with unusually long arms and unrealistically sharp shoulders, recalling the angularity, nudity, and even tiny nipples of Austrian Expressionist painter Egon Schiele's self-portraiture. The panel's perspective changes dramatically, and the reader observes the protagonist and her child from 4 different angles across the first 5 panels of their search for treasure. The second panel of the series features a perspective from directly in front of the protagonist, with the viewpoint positioned perhaps in front of the figure's midsection. The third and fourth panels feature aerial views. However, Feuchtenberger complicates this representation of space by making elements of the scene visible that contradict the perspectival view from above. For example, the second panel presents the reader with a view of both the top of the protagonist's head and the bottom of her left foot. Furthermore, the architecture behind the protagonist is towering over her and threatening to break out of the picture plane, while the flat surfaces of the building's uppermost levels are also visible to the viewer. Again, in the third panel, space seems to be folding in on itself, where the viewer's perspective is simultaneously looking up from the ground, with sight obscured by plant life, while also looking down from above, with the back of the head of both the mother and child visible as they bend down to inspect the earth. With the panel's stark geometric impulse, the claustrophobic and collapsing spaces, angular and non-parallel architectural lines, and dramatic and changing perspectives, Feuchtenberger's art echoes the aesthetic of Expressionist cinema. Specifically recalling the film stills of The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari from 1920, Bamy and Klet's distorted landscapes, collapsing and claustrophobic architectural spaces, irregular lighting, deep shadows, and imaginative cityscapes mirror the aesthetic of the dark and distressing stories of early German cinema. However, the overwhelming Expressionist impression of Feuchtenberger's art relates not to the panel's construction of space, nor how the figure's angular and elongated proportions recall Expressionist painting. Rather, it's Feuchtenberger's style of artistic representation, which mimics the visual vocabulary of early 20th century engraving that echoes German Expressionism on a formal level, and specifically the art of woodcut printing. Like the founders of the Expressionist artist group Die Brücke, Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, Karl Schmidt-Rottloff, Erich Henkel, and Fritz Bleel, the space represented in Feuchtenberger's work is textured with repetitive geometric forms that flatten the picture plane and patterned line work that develops depth, while the bodies depicted are sharp and angular with odd elongated proportions. Feuchtenberger's panels' flat and dense planes of black and white stand in stark contrast to the texture she builds in the background and foreground of her images. Her line work is clear with bold demarcations that rarely blur or fade into the background, and she develops her deviation in tone, saturation, and shade through complex patterns of cross-hatching dots and parallel and non-parallel lines. Feuchtenberger's sense of space thereby simultaneously is flattened through the planes of black and white and assigned depth through the intricate pattern work. This visual style is particularly legible in the Bamy and Klet series, but Feuchtenberger's mobilization of the woodcut print aesthetic is apparent in all of her work between 1993 and 2003. While Feuchtenberger's black and white palette recalls the printwork of Die Brücke, her emphasis on the female body and intimate relationship between mother and child echo the engravings of another important Expressionist printmaker, Käthe Kollwitz, and the sequentiality of her art points to the influence of Franz Masseria's woodcuts. Yet despite the implication of this artistic strategy and references to Feuchtenberger's woodcut print aesthetic, she does not employ the technical aspects of such printmaking. Instead, she mobilizes the characteristic texture of Expressionist engraving, painstakingly reproducing the geometry and detailed patterning of the medium by hand. She thereby creates works that emulate the printmaking culture of Germany before World War I, but still undeniably possess traces of the artist's hand, the artist's signature style, and influences from the post-World War I period until modern day. In fact, the woodcut print aesthetic is just one of many Expressionist influences that the artist integrates to produce her unique visual aesthetic. In line with Platthaus's contention, Feuchtenberger's turn to Expressionism might not seem surprising considering her graphic arts training at the Kunsthochschule Berlin-Weißensee during the most radical and experimental decade of GDR artistic practice. East German poster art is often naively associated with the artistic mandates of socialist realism. However, it was in fact an artistic space that had its own set of modernist aesthetics that allowed room for experimentation. Furthermore, after the 1970s, when the legacy of East German Expressionism was officially adopted into East German aesthetic traditions, Expressionism became an important mode of representation in all areas of East German artistic practice. However, while the East German neo-expressionism of the 1970s and 1980s can be written into the legacy of German Expressionism, its relationship with early German modernism was fraught and evolved to look very different than the aesthetic strategies of Expressionist art popular in the first 3 decades of the 20th century. I would therefore like to spend the next few minutes outlining the integration of German modernism, and specifically German Expressionism, into East Germany's art history. In the immediate post-war period, very few stylistic differences existed between the occupied zones of divided Germany, where all artistic production attempted to distance itself from the Nazi past through a number of aesthetic practices. However, already in 1946, cultural ambassadors began encouraging the Soviet-occupied sector to adopt Soviet socialist realism as the model for post-war German artistic production. With the founding of the GDR in 1949, the Stalinization of art was institutionalized in the battle against capitalism. 2 years later, the Socialist Unity Party of Germany, or the SED, adopted policy against formalism, and in 1953, socialist realism became the official cultural policy of the GDR. By 1960, however, the SED began to reevaluate their position on the proto-revolutionary art of the pre-war period and began sponsoring working groups that would reverse GDR's cultural policy, lambasting German modernism, and instigate the liberalization of the party's cultural politics over the following decades. In his opening address for the symposium at the Humboldt-Universität in Berlin in November 1960, art historian Ulrich Kuhert provided his reconsideration of the history of German proletarian revolutionary art. He spoke about the tradition as it harkened back to the 19th century and culminated in the work of Käthe Kollwitz, who had previously been harshly criticized and not regarded as a positive contributor to socialist realism. In direct contradiction to the origins of socialist realist art publicized in the 1950s, Kuhert cited the origins of German socialist realism with the founding of the Communist Party, or KPD, in 1919, and those artists aligned with the party in creating proto-revolutionary art, in quotations. Kuhert also identified the key components of socialist realism, which thematized the worker with the goal of awakening the workers' movement in Germany, while also maintaining an organic tie between the people and art. But importantly, he prescribed no specific medium or style. Moreover, he considered Käthe Kollwitz's notably German Expressionist memorial woodcut for Karl Liebknecht as exemplary of the origins of socialist realism, and acknowledged the German Expressionist members of the Association of Revolutionary Visual Artists of Germany, George Gross, John Hartfield, Rudolf Schlichter, Otto Dix, Otto Nagel, Oskar Nährlinge, as having made the most significant contributions to East German socialist realism. April 1964 marked a turning point in East German aesthetics. At the 5th Congress of the Verband der Bildenden Künstler, organization of fine artists, art historian Hermann Raum, sculptor Fritz Kremer, and Leipziger Schule painter Bernhard Heissig shocked administrators and members by attacking the East German cultural policy that rejected methods of modernism as unusable for socialism. Warning that artistic stagnation and provincialism would result from SED policies, Heissig spoke in favor of artistic experimentation with modern artistic styles. He believed artistic freedom should be given back to the artist, and artists, not politicians, should decide what constituted communist art. Heissig was harshly criticized for his comments and was forced to subsequently release a self-criticism 6 months later to prove his loyalty to the party. Official artistic doctrine did, however, begin to loosen. In his article Wir müssen über den Form sprechen in 1964, Siegfried Bergenau, editor-in-chief of the SED art publication Bildende Kunst, wrote that many artistic paths could lead to realist art, with the statement being more important than the realistic representation. Ultimately, it was this perspective on socialist realist art that Erich Honecker sanctioned in his closing remarks at the 4th conference of the Central Committee of the SED on December 17, 1971, where he concluded that, quote, if one starts out from the solid position of socialism, then there cannot be, in my view, any taboos in the field of art and literature. That applies to both the shaping of the content and of style, end quote. His election marked an official shift in cultural policy, And even though this official opening up of cultural policy only lasted until 1976, when Wolf Biermann was expatriated, also resulting in a mass exodus of artistic and intellectual figures emigrating out of East Germany, it left a lasting impact on all of East German artistic production to come. While the aesthetics of modernism came under attack again and again from the 1970s onwards, the SED officially changed their perspective on the pre-war art of the Weimar leftists, seeking to legitimize socialist realism by claiming it naturally stemmed out of the expressionist art of the proletarian revolutionary artists, and these same artists' anti-fascist art of the immediate post-war period. Cultural authorities began to incorporate the socially conscious art of the ASO artists and the German avant-garde into the artistic tradition of socialist realism. Consequently, all pre-war humanist and anti-fascist art was reinterpreted from the 1970s onwards as early socialist art, thus creating a continuity between the socialist realism of the day and the artistic practices of early German modernism. Feuchtenberger's education in the last decade of the GDR had already incorporated this lineage of early German expressionism. Neo-expressionist aesthetics were therefore no longer the radical and alternative visual rhetoric they were in the 1960s and 1970s. Instead, they were a stylistic language that had become convention in some forms of East German artistic production. This was especially true in the GDR poster art, and specifically in the genre of theater posters, which was both an important part of Feuchtenberger's training in the graphic arts and an essential avenue of income for her after 1989. Yet, like her comics, Feuchtenberger's posters after 1989 look nothing like the neo-expressionist art of East Germany. And comparing Feuchtenberger's pre- and post-1989 work illuminates the shift in her aesthetics. So as you can see here, we have two posters that she created right after the fall of the wall, 91 and 92. And this is the final project that she did to graduate from her art school, where she did a series of promotional materials for a Soviet film festival. This is the only remaining example. That's her there holding it from 1988. Oh, and then to compare it to sort of what she's been doing more recently, this is from 2006 and 2003. She's since returned to charcoal and sort of a more rounded, realistic representational mode for figures. So you can see how a dramatic shift happened after 1989 in her work. Even though Feuchtenberger was trained during the 1980s in Plakatkunst, or poster art, with the aesthetics of her poster art before 1989 aligning with the representational modes of East German neo-expressionism, her graphic art after 1989 does not emulate this visual language. Instead, Feuchtenberger embraced the aesthetic of the woodcut print and early German expressionism. Contradicting Plathaus's claim that an explicit continuity exists between Feuchtenberger's training in East German graphic arts and her innovations in graphic narration after the fall of Berlin Wall, the aesthetic roots of Feuchtenberger's stylistic innovations were not entirely born of her East German training and the expressionist aesthetics specific to the GDR in the 1970s and 1980s. Instead, Feuchtenberger's visual rhetoric is indebted to an earlier form of German expressionism that predated the GDR altogether. Located in the expressionist art of Die Brücke collective and artists such as Franz Massariel, Käthe Kollwitz, Otto Dix, George Grosz, and Egon Schiele, the question remains, however, why early German modernism? How did Feuchtenberger come to adopt an early German expressionist visual style in her artistic production after 1989? And what factors led this artist and others to mimic the aesthetics of the woodcut print instead of another form of representation? It has often been acknowledged that the turn to comics by Feuchtenberger and other members of PGH Glühende Zukunft was inspired by their introduction to the avant-garde comics anthology, Raw, which they began reading after 1989, something Feuchtenberger herself has attested to. Yet comments on their visual aesthetic nevertheless assert its indebtedness to the East German graphic arts. Considering that Feuchtenberger's art bears striking resemblances to some of the alternative comics published in Raw magazine in the 1980s and 1990s, it appears that American alternative comics inspired Feuchtenberger to adopt more than the comics form. So here on the left we have Mark Bayer, spelt wrong, actually. And on the right, we have Mark Caro. We'll be seeing more of their work as we continue. When the wall fell in 1989, Feuchtenberger moved to West Berlin to continue her artistic endeavors with other PGH Glühende Zukunft members, Henning Wagenfeld, Detlef Beck, and Holger Fickelschere. Like many East Germans at the time, they became quickly inundated with the West German and American cultural material that they had not had access to in East Germany. One such document was the American alternative comics anthology, Raw, produced by Art Spiegelman and Francois Moulet. While East Germany had a quasi-comics culture, the children's comic book series Mosaik and Atze, for example, here we have two issues of Mosaik, both which began in 1955. The medium was referred to as Bildergeschichten, picture stories, and no comics for adult audiences existed. The discovery of Raw by this group of artists was therefore transformative. In addition to introducing avant-garde American and European comics to the art collective, Raw magazine demonstrated the possibilities of the expressionist visual rhetoric in the comics form. The obvious aesthetic and narrative parallels between the sequential art of Feuchtenberger and the comics of, here we go, you start seeing my thumb, see? And the comics of Mark Bayer and Mark Caro, both published in Raw, for example, leads us to question, how did international trends in comics production inform Feuchtenberger's adoption of early German modernism? The following section of this presentation therefore positions Feuchtenberger's artistic innovations alongside developments in the alternative comics internationally, looking to the myriad of expressionist visual rhetorics published in Raw as an important factor in Feuchtenberger's adoptions of the aesthetic of the woodcut print. The visual rhetoric of Expressionism has been familiar to American comics since Will Eisner's adoption and popularization of the graphic novel in 1978. After all, it was the Expressionist woodcut novels of Lien that inspired Eisner in his production of the supposed first graphic novel, A Contract with God, and later Art Spiegelman's Mouse, the Pulitzer Prize-winning graphic novel that put comics on the proverbial map. However, Spiegelman's first experiments in Expressionism predate even Eisner's canonical text, when he first produced his experimental 4-page comic, Prisoner on Hell Planet in 1972, and Real Dream 3 years later in 1975. While there is no way to talk conclusively about the adoption of specific representational styles during different periods of comic history, artistic choices often conceded to artistic trends. And it is safe to say that there are some clear aesthetic and thematic differences to emerge between the underground comics and alternative comic scenes. The underground comics of the late 1960s and 1970s sought to push back on the restrictions of the Comics Code of the 1950s, which stipulated no sex, no violence, and no social relevance. So they emphasized leftist politics and the sexual and debased aspects of human nature through the themes of drug use, sex, violence, anti-Vietnam protest, and rock music. Epitomized in the work of Robert Crumb, who was at first only associated with the San Francisco comics scene, but later became synonymous with the underground comics movement as a whole, Crumb's crude, crass, and misogynist comic style defined both the archetypal content of the period and the visual language of its expression. However, during the mid-1970s, the underground comic scene began to stagnate. What emerged as underground comics began to wane in popularity were generically known as alternative comics. Generally speaking, they were adult-oriented comics, sometimes science fiction, autobiographical, or horror, but overall experimental in form and content, seeking political relevance and presenting increasingly sophisticated visual aesthetics. The lingering influence of the period came in the form of a new kind of avant-garde comic, typified in Raw magazine. First published in 1980 with a print run of 4,500 copies, Raw introduced a new generation of experimental comics artists working in a variety of visual languages. Artistic style within Raw varied dramatically, with regular contributions by a number of artists over the first 8 issues of the first volume, including the scratchy and expressive punk rock-styled comic Jimbo by Gary Painter, who is, quote, king of the ratty line, end quote. The delicate ink washes of Ben Catcher, the pointillist precision of Drew Friedman, the grotesque and deformed bodies of Mark Bayer, the bold, clear lines of Charles Burns, and the scratchboard illustrations of Scott Gills. While also an homage to Harvey Kurtzman's Mad, with its all-capital three-letter title and similarly cheeky bylines, Raw was a lavishly produced large-format anthology that was obviously intended to be a work of art. Its format, comparable to other New York art scene tabloids at the time, specifically Andy Warhol's Interview, made it clear that Spiegelman and Mouly's intention was to showcase the art featured within the magazine. Spiegelman sought new talent directly from his class at the School of Visual Arts in New York, including Mark Newgarden, Drew Friedman, and Katz, many of whom engaged their formal arts training in their production of sequential art more holistically than earlier comics artists, thereby lending the self-referentiality, artistic depth, and formal complexity of avant-garde art to the comics production showcased in Raw. The impact of Raw and the role of Spiegelman and Mouly in developing the alternative comic scene cannot be overstated. As a collection of cartooning talent, no other single comics production has ever equaled Raw's accomplishments. Flipping through the pages, it is clear that the visual language of alternative comics expanded upon the visual rhetorics of the underground comic scene to incorporate new and innovative styles. And so this is one issue of Raw. This is Raw 5. And I took a picture of the first page of every comic or illustration in the volume so that you can see how varied it really was. Underground comics had shown artists that the comics form was not defined by any particular age group, art style, or subject matter. However, it was in alternative comics that the visual language of the medium really proliferated and diversified. And importantly, it was also around this time that an expressionist artistic language emerged, not only engaged the composition, angularity, and woodcut print aesthetic of early German modernism, but it also featured a dramatic shift in content as well. The centerpiece of Raw was Spiegelman's own story, Mouse. Mouse had previously appeared in prototype form in a 3-page comic in the underground comics magazine Funny Animals, published in 1972 by Apex Novelties. But in Raw, it became a serialized graphic narrative, published a chapter at a time. The comic recounted the story of Spiegelman's father's life in Poland and experience of the Holocaust, representing Jews as mice and Nazis as cats in the greatest antagonism between Tom and Jerry ever penned. Subverting the conventions of the comics medium to use funny animals to represent such serious subject matter was itself interventional. However, openly tackling traumatic history through the comics form was revolutionary. After winning the Pulitzer Prize in 1992, Spiegelman's Mouse had successfully proven that comics could tell important, accessible stories that had absolutely nothing to do with superheroes. Mouse forever changed the content and perception of the medium, paving the way for comics to be incorporated into serious literary discussion and academic study. They finally escaped the humor shelves in commercial bookstores. The representational mode of Mouse also drew significant attention. In contradiction to the comical aesthetic position suggested by the representation of human figures as animals, the visual language of the comic itself was dark, dense, and morbid. The panels and images are exclusively in black and white, heavily shaded with cross-hatching and solid planes of color. Divergence from the earlier visual rhetoric of underground comics is clear, as is the quasi-expressionist rendering of the figures, while the space constructed maintains an obvious adherence to realistic representational space. The shading, simplicity of the line work, and angularity of the figures' bodies is reminiscent of expressionist engraving. Furthermore, when asked how Spiegelman decided on the visual surface of Mouse, the artist even cites the art of important German expressionist George Grosz. This influence is made especially explicit when the panels from the chapters of Mouse featured in Raw are compared to the prototype in Funny Animals, which featured a more conventional strategy of portraying cartoon animals while also emulating the archetypal mode of representation of underground comics and the stylization of the figures themselves. Looking at the original printings of the chapters in Raw, the connection to the aesthetics of printmaking is clear, both as a consequence of the quality of the printing and in the cover art chosen for the mini-issues themselves, as well as in the enlarged images Spiegelman selected to showcase for the work. So what I found really interesting about seeing these originals is when you see the anthology of Maus, everything looks so clean. But when you look at how they are originally printed, because the quality of the paper was not as high, because this was a very independent group of artists, it just looks rougher and scratchier. So it was really interesting to have access to these originals. However, returning to Spiegelman's earliest incarnation of the Maus narrative, Prisoner on the Hell Planet, which not only inspired the visual rhetoric of the subsequent chapters, but also became part of the graphic narrative itself within Raw and later published with the collection of chapters, Spiegelman's expressionist influence is much easier to trace. In 1972, Spiegelman published Prisoner on Hell Planet in Short Order Comics #1. As a powerful representation of the suicide of his concentration camp survivor mother, Prisoner on Hell Planet is remarkable for the way in which it deals with the traumatic experience remembered by her son. However, it is not only the content that lends power to the depiction. It is also its mode of representation, decidedly expressionist. Prisoner on Hell Planet was drafted on scratchboard, a form of direct engraving in which the artist uses a sharp tool to scrape off dark ink, revealing a white or colored layer beneath. Unlike conventional drawing, scratchboard requires the artist to develop the image through the addition of highlights, and is thereby able to reproduce the sharpness, contrast, and texture of more traditional forms of engraving without the painstaking process of working with metal or wood. However, the aesthetic produced often mirrors the geometry and angularity of other forms of engraving. Moreover, in Spiegelman's 2010 Paris Review essay on the expressionist woodcuts of Lien, he situates his own work in Maus within the lineage of expressionist woodcut wordless novels, citing Ward as one of his many inspirations. With the appearance of his expressionist experiments in Arcade Review, Real Dream, 1975, and later in Raw magazine, Spiegelman both defined the parameters of the emergent genre while also perhaps representing a new direction in the visual language of alternative comics thereafter. In fact, since Spiegelman and Eisner's initial mobilization of the style, Expressionism and the aesthetics of expressionist printmaking have continued to influence comics. The dark, angular, and psychological landscape of Batman, for example, and specifically Tim Burton's films from 1989 and 1982, unequivocally draw on expressionist visual strategies as well as film noir, which itself has its roots in German expressionism, as does the work of other artists that appeared in Raw during the 1980s and early 1990s. Gary Painter and Bruno Richard's punk rock, scratchy, and chaotic expressive lines, Mark Caro and Jerry Mori. Let's see. We have Gary Painter. Yeah, we go. Gary Painter and Bruno Richard. Then Mark Caro and Jerry Moriarty's mobilization of the woodcut print aesthetic. Jose Antonio Munoz and Mark Bayer's grotesque bodies in black and white. And Scott Gill's, Pascal Dorey's, and Mark Fisher's scratchboard comics and illustration all register as neo-expressionist. While each individual artist's adoption or interpretation of expressionism and the aesthetics of printmaking might have originated from different influences, which would have been difficult to perceive from the point of reception, the pervasiveness of these aesthetics in alternative comics was clear. Even Robert Crumb's work in Raw in 1985 moves towards mimicking the aesthetics of printmaking and conventions of film noir. And by the 8th and final issue of the first volume of Raw in 1986, Spiegelman and Moulet even go so far as to characterize the humor section of the edition as expressionist. The expressionist yokes, abstract jests. Subtitled, Some Raw Artists Seeking Inspiration, Gags of Raw 8 is a collage of historical and contemporary artwork featuring a variety of artistic modes of representation from around the world, collapsing any distinction between art historical time and space. And importantly, it features 2 images from woodcut novelist and expressionist printmaker Franz Massaril, among other images by Mark Caro, Wayne White, Charles Burns, and others, which in fact also look like woodcuts. The expressionist yokes of Spiegelman's 8th issue thereby bring the expressionist influences of Raw in full circle. Ultimately, there existed an expressionist impulse in the visual language of alternative comics. This either manifested as a trend in artists' mode of representation or an editorial decision by Spiegelman and Moulet in their selection of work to publish. Either way, the result was the same, and the neo-expressionist work in Raw encouraged other artists to adopt the visual language. Reading Raw, Feuchtenberger would have encountered this myriad of expressionist visual languages in the aesthetics of alternative comics. Familiar with the neo-expressionist visual rhetoric prevalent in East German poster art, the early German modernist style of American alternative comics would have resonated with her, while also reflecting the spirit of the revolutionary events surrounding German unification aesthetically. By adopting this mode of representation, Feuchtenberger aligned her artistic endeavors with a stylistic language that embodied the revolutionary moment of 1989 by visually revisiting the aesthetics of protest of the early 20th century and American alternative comics simultaneously. Her early expressionist aesthetic thereby anticipated the political interventions of her work in her poster art for the East German women's movement and related comics in Mutterkuchen, which is something I look at in my dissertation, her feminist activism around 1989 to 1991 and the work that she did with East German feminists. In conclusion, Feuchtenberger's appropriation of the aesthetic of the woodcut print, sharp corners, collapsing and contradicting architectural spaces, and distorted and grotesque bodies hail from an earlier iteration of German Expressionism than the alternative visual rhetorics of Neo-Expressionism in the GDR. However, they are also not directly derived from the iterations of Expressionism found in American alternative comics in the 1980s and 1990s. Instead, Feuchtenberger's expressionist aesthetics come from a combination of these influences. Feuchtenberger's adoption of the visual language of early German Expressionism was therefore neither an extension of the aesthetics of East Germany, as some German comics historians have argued, nor, as Feuchtenberger herself attests, a reaction against them. Instead, the expressionist visual rhetoric of Feuchtenberger's early sequential art was a combination of both impulses. Appropriating the aesthetic of the woodcut print simultaneously differentiated her art from the alternative and experimental art to emerge out of East Germany in the last decade of the GDR and the state-mandated aesthetics of socialist realism, while allowing her to continue to work within a familiar aesthetic paradigm that embodied the revolutionary politics of the moment and engaged in an important artistic style of alternative American comics. Ultimately, the work of Feuchtenberger and other members of PGH Glühende Zukunft marked the emergence of a new hybrid form of cultural production at the intersection between multiple expressionisms and the politics of 1989. Feuchtenberger's graphic art drew together divergent expressionist traditions from various sources of influence to create a new mode of representation that complicated both Dumke and Wilmar's conviction of West German hegemony after unification and Platthaus's assertion that East German artistic traditions reinvented German comics after 1989 at the same time. Thank you. If anybody has any questions. Yes.
I have one. I'd like to know more from you as to what you're reading of the German reading that the Communist Party really was engaged with the production of the early Expressionist work. Why not?
So my reading of that turn of events, that
statement that
yeah. Well, it was a move of desperation because it really alienated an entire generation of artists when they turned away from the Expressionist and Avant-Garde art of the early 20th century, because all of these artists identified as communists. And all of a sudden their art was no longer relevant because the revolution had happened. So it really alienated all of these artists and didn't reinforce a growing of socialist realism on German soil. So it was a desperate move in order to try to renegotiate their position within German art history, because it was coming from the Soviet Union. And they had to make sure that German artists felt that they had a connection to this tradition. And they were constantly rewriting the biographies of artists to try to fit them in out of certain artistic legacies in a really, really interesting way. The way they engaged Albrecht Dürer, for example, and his biography and role in illustrating the peasants' revolt, for example. So there's these switches that happen. So if you follow the whole thing, it's really fascinating, the political, the politics of the aesthetics of realism and abstraction when you look on both sides of the Berlin Wall.
little bit about the role of color? It seems that a lot of the examples you cited, including other comics like Raw, which had illustrated covers and some interior pages, really made heavy use of the expressive potentials of color. But a lot of the comics that you gave as examples were very strictly black and white. Was that primarily a financial?
Well, so I think there was some color in Raw, but for the most part, it was used strategically. So the one volume that I went through, it kind of had a funnies section. Usually, most of the entire volume is in black and white. Like here, Gary Panter's use of color here is very striking. But most of the comics in Raw were all black and white, and I think with sparse use of color. Where's my? Come on. So when you look at this one, these pages of color, the material of the paper changes. It's trying to mimic the funny section of newspapers. So this wasn't characteristic of every issue of Raw in the first volume. For the most part, the artist gravitated towards black and white, and I think I can't really speak to that choice. But when you see Mark Bayer, who has published Amy and Jordan, and all of his work is in black and white. But when you see it in this volume, for example, like you can see it's colored. It's very bizarre to see Mark Bayer in color. It's very unusual. And then also some of these other artists, like this Jack Survives. He's in almost every issue of the first 8 of Raw, Moriarty, and usually it's entirely in black and white. So they were making a statement with this issue trying to mimic the funny section of newspapers. But all of these artists tend to gravitate towards black and white. Maybe it's a poor example to choose from, but I thought it was fun to look at.
Could you speak a little bit to how in your research you found that Raw actually was being looked at by these artists?
Yeah. So in interviews, they cite that they were inspired by Raw. So that's coming from them directly. What part of Raw inspired them becomes, that's where I try to think critically, because yes, they were reading Raw. They started reading some bande dessinée at the same time as well. So I just take that there existed Raw in their purview, and I know that Feuchtenberger herself has identified Mark Bayer as an important influence for her, and then Wagenbett, the other artist that I'm looking at. So there's a few artists, they're like, oh, we really like this work, and then I'm like, well, where did they find that work? How did they encounter it? And that's where I've come to looking through these issues of Raw. You see some comparisons with Feuchtenberger's work, but then it's really striking her colleague, Henning Wagenbett, the format of the panels, the wordlessness, and some of these other aesthetic characteristics that I'm seeing in Raw are very pronounced in his own work. And I feel like he actually downplayed his influence of Raw more than Feuchtenberger did. So it's my entry point is things that they've commented in their interviews, and from there I run with it, sometimes contradicting their own assertions.
I'm curious, this group, how long did it persist? Did it help them a lot? Give them a sense of identity?
It began as an artist collective that was politically motivated. It was founded in 1988, and during the Monday demonstrations, they were handing out leaflets and flyers, selling them for a mark to try to make some money at the same time. And they worked in the same studio, but they didn't work together. So it was a different sort of model for an artist collective. They were just a bunch of East German graphic artists, some of which met in art school, and then after 1989, they did exhibitions together. And Feuchtenberger and Wagenbett worked a lot in theater houses doing poster work, so they supported each other in that way. And then Feuchtenberger independently did a lot of political work with feminist groups around 1989. But both of them became very disillusioned by the political process after 1991 and the unification vote, because they were among those East German intellectuals that were looking for a third way, some sort of in-between where they didn't lose East Germany was reformed instead of abolished. So they became very disillusioned after 1991, and you can see that in their art. And by 1993, the group disbanded. And I work with these two artists because I find that their artistic production is very important because they became two of the most prominent teachers of graphic narration in Germany. Anke Feuchtenberger has taught essentially every German graphic novelist publishing in Germany today. So that's the end of my dissertation, sort of looking at the legacy of her work through the work of her students. And Wagenfeld has been teaching in Berlin for just as long. And there's one third East German graphic artist, Attack, who is also a prominent teacher of graphic narration in Germany. So it's interesting, these formally trained comics artists then had the credentials to become teachers. And so they could enter the art institutions of United Germany and start formalizing the training of comics, which is really unique.
So where is she now?
She is in Hamburg teaching. Yeah, she still teaches. She lives in a small East German town in a restored farmhouse, but teaches at the HAW in Hamburg, teaching graphic narration and illustration. So not explicitly comics, but then all of the final projects of her students are always comics. And her students have developed a really, for several years, there was a prominent student-run magazine where a lot of the young German graphic novelists got their feet wet. And the German scene isn't huge, but I think it's inspiring.
Well, any more questions? No.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for coming. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.